Now, I'm delighted to tell you that Monzo Business are now a proud partner of The Rest is Money. We're teaming up for the next 6 months. You'll be hearing why they're a great option for your business banking and how they're supporting small businesses up and down the UK. Now, since I am a Monzo Business customer already, I can tell you all about it. They've got 3 different plans to choose from depending on the size of your business. So, for example, with 2 of us in mind, me and my business partner, in our latest venture, we've opted for the Pro version, which comes with a load of tools to help us simplify all of that financial admin. There's also Light for sole traders and Team for those slightly larger businesses that are scaling up. So why not join me and over 500,000 businesses already banking with Monzo Business and sign up for an account today. Only sole traders or limited company directors in the UK can apply. Invoicing is available with Monzo Business Pro for £9 a month and Team for £25 a month. T's and C's apply.
Hello and welcome to The Rest is Money with me, Robert Peston.
And me, Steph McGovern.
So we've got Richard Hughes, who runs, some would say, the most important sort of government institution in the country, the Office for Budget Responsibility, which is supposed to keep the government honest when it comes to borrowing, taxing. And I think it was probably brought to the sort of public attention most when Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng ignored it. And they careered into financial crisis, almost bankrupted the country.
Yeah, so Richard, who is chair of the Office for Budget Responsibility, has had quite a few jobs in the sector. He's worked at the Treasury, worked for the IMF as well. So loads to talk to him about in terms of, the spring statement, OBR's growth figures and everything else that's going on with Trump and the economy.
And so here is our interview with Richard Hughes. Richard, great to see you. We're recording this before Donald Trump announces to the world the tariffs that he's imposing on America's trading partners. You've recently done some work, though, on the costs for the UK economy of tariffs of around 20% and different scenarios for, whether we retaliate or not. Could you just talk us through those?
That's right. When we were putting together the forecast for the spring statement last week, US tariff policy was changing from day to day. So our central forecast didn't include any US tariffs on the rest of the world. But we did look at scenarios in which the US imposed additional 20% tariffs unilaterally on the rest of the world with no retaliation from other countries, as well as a scenario where the US imposed an additional 20% tariffs and the rest of the world retaliated in kind. In the first scenario, where there are just unilateral US additional 20% tariffs, taking the sort of average tariff rate up to the 25% that Donald Trump has been talking about, at its peak, you see a reduction in UK output of about 0.6%. And then in the scenario where the rest of the world retaliates, at its peak, you see a reduction in UK output relative to our central forecast of around 1%.
And that's a permanent loss of income in the UK.
So that's at its peak next year, sort of at the height of the disruption associated with additional tariffs. In the medium term, on the first scenario of just unilateral tariffs, you see a fall in output of about a 1/3%. In the scenario where you see retaliation, there's a long-term reduction in output of about 0.75%.
And so put that into the context of other shocks that we've had, obviously way less than the COVID shock, certainly in the short term, significantly less than the impact of the global financial crisis.
That's right. I mean, in the end, we are an open economy. Trade makes up a significant share of our GDP, but the US is we don't trade a lot in goods with the US, so the direct impact on the UK is relatively small compared to some other countries which do export a lot in terms of goods to the US. Our US goods export are about £60 billion. But we do have effects directly on that goods trade, but also we face indirect effects because other countries which do trade a lot with the US feel effects on their production, on their export. That affects their incomes and ultimately their demand for our exports to other more important trading partners like the European Union.
So it feels like, Richard, then, we only spoke to the Chancellor last week about this, and of course you did the forecasting around it. This headroom's going to disappear very quickly, isn't it?
So it's one of the risks to what is a relatively small amount of headroom. I mean, £10 billion sounds like a lot of money until you realise that we've got an economy of £3 trillion. And also, government revenue is around £1.5 trillion. Government spending is around £1.5 trillion. So this is about 1% in 5 years' time of variation around that total for tax and expenditure. And so in that sense, lots of relatively small changes to our forecast could affect that headroom. In terms of the long run growth rate of the UK, it would just take 0.1 off the average rate of growth over the next 5 years to speak for that headroom if that turned out to be lower. And these scenarios that I outlined, an additional 20% tariffs, we ran it through our fiscal models, and what it shows is that should be also just enough to about wipe out the headroom that the Chancellor's got, because it depresses domestic economic activity, it depresses domestic tax revenues, and therefore you lose it. You lose it in terms of your domestic revenue generation capacity. And what we also showed is that if you retaliate and you levy your own tariffs against the US, you get some additional tariff revenue of about £9 or £10 billion from trade with the US. But because the impact of the higher inflation and the consequences of retaliation on the part of the rest of the world depresses UK output, you lose roughly the same amount in domestic tax revenues. So even in the retaliation scenario where you're putting up taxes on US imports, fiscally you're not net better off because ultimately you're depressing your ability to generate revenues from your domestic economy.
So there's lots to unpick here. Just on that point, would you argue, therefore, particularly given that our manufacturing sector and our agricultural sector, collectively not much more than 10% of the economy, that the rational thing for the UK to do is not to retaliate?
I mean, these are decisions for policymakers and for the people who are responsible for the negotiations.
But the straight short to medium term economics would say don't retaliate, wouldn't it?
I mean, trade wars in general are not optimal for any of the parties taking part of them. And if you're a small open economy, you feel the effects of not just tariffs on yourself, but also the tariffs that are levied on the rest of the world.
Now, I want to get back, though, to the point that Steph made, which is the risk to the Chancellor that come the autumn in her budget, the headroom will have been wiped out. She'll have to raise taxes again or cut spending again. You put in your recent report on all this that there was only a 54% probability that she would meet her targets, that the headroom would be preserved. Can you just tell us, on the basis of, the OBR's been in existence, for about 14 years now?
Yep.
Is that the lowest ever probability of the fiscal targets being met? Is she taking the biggest risk of any chancellor in that period?
It's one of the lowest, and if you think about it in terms of the level of headroom different chancellors have set aside against their respective fiscal targets over the last 15 years, the average has been about 30 billion, and this chancellor set aside about a third of that. So it's the third lowest amount of headroom a chancellor set aside against her fiscal objectives.
But that's an absolute number. There are also relative issues here, so which is why I'm wondering whether 54% is an all-time low in terms of the risk she's taking.
It'll be one of the lowest, and we've certainly had numbers in the very low 50s. And I should say that the probability against the other target she has, which is to get net financial liabilities falling in 5 years' time, is even lower at just 51%. So almost even odds. And again, that's just a measure of, in an economy of £3 trillion with a public sector which is getting up to nearly half of that in terms of revenue and spending. £10 billion is just a very small amount of money, especially when you take into account the amount of volatility we've seen economically in this country over the last few years and are likely to continue to face in the next few years. We've seen interest rates going up by 100 basis points just in between our two forecasts, the one we did in the autumn and now. Just half of that amount of volatility going forward would be enough to wipe out the headroom that the Chancellor's got. Very small changes about assumptions for the rate of growth, and also, what we've already seen in terms of threats to global trading arrangements.
I mean, we've talked a lot about the volatility there. It kind of feels like, and it sounds like every day you're having to kind of reforecast based on what the latest thing is. Quite often, Trump said. Is there any point, given the world we're in at the minute and how unstable it is, at forecasting? Because, like when we interviewed Rachel Reeves last week, she must have mentioned the OBR about 15 times. And it feels like the government have become so obsessed with what you're saying. It feels like political decisions are kind of bound by what you say rather than guided. Yet it's really impossible to forecast at the moment. And it just feels like, should everyone just take a breather and stop forecasting and just focus on getting growth, but without thinking about all the uncertainty. It just feels like forecasting's pointless, and she's only going to come back in a few months and tell us the figures are wrong again.
Since I've been at the job, which started in 2020, we've always been forecasting in the midst of uncertainty and shocks to the UK economy. I started in this job in the middle of COVID. We then had the Russian invasion of Ukraine, big rise in energy prices. We then had a period where interest rates rose very rapidly from below 1% up to where they are now at around 4.5%. All of those things were very big shocks to the UK macroeconomy. Now there is uncertainty about future trading arrangements. And so one of the things which we always try and emphasize when we put together our forecasts is the law requires us to produce a central forecast and produce an assessment about whether, based on that forecast and the government's policies at the time, are they on track to meet their fiscal targets? That's a question Parliament wants us to answer every time that we do a forecast. But what we also try and do in our forecasts is emphasize the uncertainty around those forecasts, the risk fans around each one of those central forecasts. We also produce another publication in the summer called the Fiscal Risks and Sustainability Report, where we try and look in more depth at what are the kind of risks and vulnerabilities in the UK public finances. Where might future shocks come from that policymakers need to think about? And I think those reports, I think, are just as important as our central forecasts, which end up getting a lot more attention, I think, in the media. But they look at what might drive our forecast off course over the next 5 years, as well as what are the longer term trends that policymakers need to think about when making fiscal policy. Things like demographic change, things like climate change, things like what might happen in global debt markets, which in the longer term can also create issues and challenges for Chancellor.
So I think we do want to come back and talk about those long-term trends, because many of them are deeply troubling. I agree with you. I think we both agree with you that part of the problems with British governments is they've focused a bit too much on the short term and not enough on these enormous challenges from, an ageing population or the cost of climate change. But I'm actually interested to ask Steph what she thinks about, actually what she's just been talking about. What we've identified in the conversation with you so far is this is a Chancellor who, in her spring statement, built in the smallest possible cushion against shocks, things going badly wrong. And I'm wondering, actually, weirdly, in a world where Donald Trump arguably is changing all the rules about how the global economy is managed, all the rules actually about how we defend ourselves, whether actually, weirdly, some people think it's really irrational for her to put herself in a position where she's almost certainly got to raise taxes or cut spending in the budget. But if this is a government which is thinking, actually, we're just going to have to totally reset our whole approach to government because of Trump, maybe you just have to see the spring statement as, just something she had to get over, and they've now got to sort of absorb precisely because, at the moment, none of us are quite sure what a Trump world looks like. We've all got to understand what that world looks like. And then they've got to have a conversation with the British public about what that means in terms of potentially quite significant changes to taxation and spending of a sort that we don't yet know about.
Just to bring this into context of real life, I've been having conversations this week with my business partners of the various businesses I'm involved in. And obviously, this week is when a lot of the tax changes from last year come in around employment. So for example, with business rate relief, off the back of the pandemic, businesses in the hospitality, leisure and fitness sector were given a big discount on paying rate reliefs. That discount has now fallen from 75% off to 40% off, which is a huge increase in business rate costs for businesses like mine. So are we looking at the wrong things at the moment? Because from a real life perspective, it's very hard out there and it doesn't look like it's going to get any better, Richard.
So I think the story that you're telling about how the UK economy feels for households and businesses, I think is a microcosm of how the whole UK economy feels, which is that we've emerged from a series of shocks with relatively slow growth in our incomes, relatively high inflation, although real incomes are starting to catch up a little bit, and also a big increase in interest rates over the last few years. And that kind of stress is also reflected in the public finances. And if you look at this through the prism of the finances that Rachel Reeves and her predecessors have managed as chancellors, what they've seen is that their income growth has been relatively slow, which is in the form of tax revenues, because productivity has been relatively sluggish since the financial crisis and also now coming out of COVID and the energy crisis. She's come out of those shocks with quite a large stock of debt, and the interest rate on that debt has gone up. And that's left us at the moment with a deficit of around 4 to 5% of GDP, which over the medium term would mean if you left it where it was, it would just keep rising and rising and rising. So the situation that we're currently in is not sustainable. And what you've seen over a period of time is a set of chancellors trying to make a set of choices to bring that deficit back down to something which looks more sustainable. And I think when you look around the world, sort of every advanced economy is going through some version of this. They've emerged from a series of shocks. They've got much higher debt. The cost of servicing that debt has gone up. They're struggling to raise the revenues in order to meet both the cost of servicing the debt, but also a society which is aging and pushing up the cost of pensions and healthcare and other things. And they are trying to look for ways to get what are relatively high deficits back down to something which looks more sustainable and ultimately get their stock of debt under control, which in the UK and in most other countries at the moment is still rising.
What Steph has said, and we all agree with this, government says it all the time, is that in the end, very little will be possible in terms of improving the majority of people's living standards, improving public services, unless we get the growth rate up. Rachel Reeves, over the moon that you basically gave the government a little bit of a boost in your growth forecast as a result of the changes they're making to planning rules, being less restrictive when it comes to big developments in terms of the planning regime. As I say, she was absolutely cock-a-hoop. You talk about it in your report as a very modest increase in the size of the economy. And sort of try and reconcile these 2 points of view, her extraordinary euphoria that you've given her anything and your view that actually it's quite small.
So I suppose what we scored in terms of the impact of planning reforms on residential investment in this forecast, and then over the medium term on potential output, added 0.2 to the level of output in 5 years' time. So that is relatively modest by the grand scope of other changes that you might make from forecast.
It's less, for example, than Trump may wipe out with his tariffs.
That's right. But I think what it illustrates is the fact that one of the ways out of I think the squeeze that Steph was highlighting from the public finances point of view is to try and get the economy to grow faster, because that generates more tax revenue, allows you to meet all the other spending pressures that governments need to face in the public finances. As a forecaster, we do try and think about and reflect where governments do make significant, durable and meaningful changes to policies that can affect the drivers of long-term growth in the UK. We do try and reflect those in our forecast for what is called the supply side or potential output of the UK. I think the challenge that all policymakers face is that the things that really matter for the long-run growth potential of the UK are a bunch of stocks. It's the stock of labour, which is about 30 million people. It's the stock of capital, which is about 200% of GDP. And it's the stock of human ideas and our ability to make use of them, which is sort of some measure of productivity. And the things which government policy levers act upon are mostly flows of things. They can affect the flow of people into and out of education in a given year, but in a given year, that's a relatively small share of the total stock of working people in the economy who have already been educated and have got the skills that they've got. They may learn some on the job, but if you're focusing on things like further and higher education, that's fine, but that's going to get maybe a few extra tens or hundreds of thousands of people into the labour force in a given year. On the housing side, you've got a stock of housing of 32 million houses. In our forecast, we think the government's planning reforms are going to add an extra 170,000 to that, on top of existing plans. That's adding 0.5 to the total stock of housing in 5 years' time.
It's not going to solve the housing crisis on its own.
Yeah, so it's not going to solve the housing crisis, but it is a sort of thing which, if you are persistent and you stick to over longer periods of time, does build up into making a meaningful difference. And the same is true of things like public investment. The total stock of capital in the UK is 200% of GDP. The government invests about 2% of GDP in a given year. So again, the government's adding 1% to the total stock of capital in the economy from one year to the next. But most of what the economy runs off are the roads and trains and airports that we've already got. And you can see out there and the quality of those.
Yeah, not great is the answer.
On that point, because I was really interested in this point about where the growth was coming from and this upgrade in the sense that it's from planning and the increase in house building and things. But and you alluded it to there when you mentioned about education. Do you factor into this that it's going to take ages to get all the right skilled people ready in time? And how do you measure that?
I mean, one thing you have to do is look beyond 5 years, because you're right that over a 5-year period, some people are leaving school. Quite a lot of people are still in school and being educated. It then takes them time to find the right job, which is the right match if they get better skills. And then it could also take time for those better skills to be reflected in higher wages. So there can be significant time lags between when you make an investment in, be it residential investment, be it physical capital, be it human capital. There can be significant time lags before you see any kind of return from that economically. That's one of the reasons why in our forecasts, we don't just look 5 years ahead to try and estimate these benefits, but we look 10 years ahead, sometimes 50 years ahead, to say if this policy was sustained for a long period of time, what would be the cumulative impact of this on a stock of people, on a stock of capital, on a stock of houses, and what kind of long-term effect might that have? I think one of the challenges that you then confront is that government policy does change relatively frequently in a lot of these areas. We've seen in the past public investment be a kind of residual in the fiscal equation. It's the thing that booms when the public finances do well, but then it's the first thing that gets cut back when the public finances are under stress. So you don't always see a sustained high level of public investment in the UK. It can look a lot more volatile, and again that means that you have years where you're not actually adding very much to the capital stock.
And there's nothing is possible in terms of growth and prosperity unless productivity improves, productivity output per person, output per hour worked. Now, you do expect productivity to improve a bit in the coming years, but you also say that there's a pretty good chance you'll be wrong. So tell us a bit about why you are more optimistic than some forecasters about that, as I say, absolutely vital trend in terms of, us getting better off. But why you say that there are some, pretty big uncertainties around it.
Yeah. So one thing to say is it is very difficult at the moment to try and understand what is going on with the productivity of the UK economy, because in the end, what it requires you to do is divide the total workforce of the UK and the total output of the UK. And both of those numbers at the moment are proving to be very volatile. There are well-known problems with what's called our labour force survey, what gives us an understanding of how many people there are in the UK economy, how many of them are working, how many hours they're working.
So can I stop you for a second? Because this is something Steph in particular is very interested in, which is that you've got a big problem at the moment because, as the government has recognised by saying it needs to actually investigate the Office for National Statistics, the data, to use a technical term, quite a lot of it appears to be crap.
It's certainly proving to be very volatile. I mean, they're running up against a set of challenges, which is this data comes from face-to-face surveys with individuals, and the response rates of those surveys have been dropping and dropping.
So out of date. It's so out of date. Like, given the technology and what AI can do now on my phone, how can we not know where people are employed, how they're employed, what they're doing? Like, how can we not know more?
So, one thing we do as forecasters is try and look at a range of different indicators, and not just what comes from these surveys, but also what comes from HMRC in terms of what they call real-time information, kind of people who are paying payroll and other taxes through the tax system. So you can try and look at these kind of sort of big data solutions. But if you want to know a lot in detail about people, then these kind of surveys tend to be your best source. But so uncertainty about the size of the workforce is one issue. The ONS has also has significantly revised its GDP data in recent years. Again, understandable given all the shocks that the UK economy has been through, and trying to understand how they work their way through the economy. But then when you're trying to figure out what is output per worker, that is basically the product of two numbers, both of which are quite uncertain. And so extracting a clear signal from that about the future productivity potential of the UK at the moment is particularly difficult. Where in this forecast we have arrived is somewhere between the relatively strong productivity performance we saw pre-financial crisis, where productivity growth was around 2%, and the very dismal productivity performance we've seen since the financial crisis, which is around 0.5%. In our forecast, productivity kind of recovers to around 1% over the medium term. So, depending on whether you think the period before the financial crisis was a good reflection of our long-term growth potential, or whether the period since the financial crisis is a better reflection of where we'll end up in the medium term, you could describe us as being either too optimistic or too pessimistic.
Do you know when obviously you do all this analysis and then you have to go to the government and say, this is what we think? Obviously, like we saw with the welfare reforms analysis, the government was saying it was going to save 5 billion, and then you guys were like, no, it's not going to be that much. What's it like when you have to go and tell them that? Like, do you get nervous? Are you like, how do you feel when you have to tell the government they've got it wrong?
Yeah, I think those conversations, and I should say they are entirely confidential. I think they are always respectful. And I think one of the things which I think is a real credit to all the chancellors that I have worked for is that, whether it's good or bad news, they use our forecast and our analysis as the basis for their fiscal decision making. And it's a relationship which I think works well into the service of Parliament, who set it up in legislation, and I think over time, which chancellors have come to see as an advantage because it gives them a clear basis on which to operate. It gives them a credible forecast on which to make policy.
Statistically, it's important to have a break in the show, so we better go to that now.
So in a moment or two, we'll get back to our gripping interview with the head of the OBR, Richard Hughes. But before that, we are just going to go to a short conversation about the outlook for small businesses, the opportunities and risks for small businesses. It's our small business barometer, brought to you by Monzo Business.
So every month we dive into a different challenge facing small and medium-sized businesses. The companies that employ 60% of the UK workforce. And this month, we want to talk about the sectors where small businesses are bucking the trend, because you hear so often, don't you, lots of negative headlines about the economy. That's probably not going to change anytime soon. But hidden beneath that doom and gloom are sectors that are quietly booming. Lots of people talk about the challenges when we're in periods of economic turmoil, but it's also full of lots of opportunities too, when there are businesses thriving, often on the quiet during these times. And so we wanted to have a bit of a chat about them. There's quite a few sectors we could talk about here. Where do you want to start?
I want to start with the sort of general point, which is there are always sectors of the economy that grow independently of the business cycle, simply because there are trends over and above economics that drive demand. But even within sectors like retail, for example, which are cyclical, if you happen to be the entrepreneur who comes up with a completely new and revolutionary way of providing a good or a service, again, you're going to do brilliantly irrespective of the cycle. That said, for all sorts of long-term reasons, there are going to be certain sectors that are going to have in the round above average growth. One of those is obviously those businesses which help us to reduce our carbon emissions. So obviously the whole green area is fantastically exciting.
Yeah, I'm really interested about the infrastructure around electric vehicles, because obviously I've got an electric vehicle and there are lots of people who live in flats who really struggle to charge their cars. And there's a lad called Gavin Malone who set up this business, Energy Park, which basically helps people, building these big flats to be able to offer charging. It's really smart what he's come up with. And he's basically been, offered loads of money from investors to scale this up and develop it. I'm also really interested, Robert, in the kind of health and wellness side of things. So I don't think I've ever mentioned this on the podcast before, but one of my other businesses is in that sector. It's called Solidity.
When you said, I don't think I've mentioned this on the podcast before, I knew it was going to be one of your own businesses.
Of course it was. But, these are businesses that are doing all right. So I feel like I've got the opportunity to talk about them. So yeah, this one is in the health and wellness space. It's called Solidity, and it's all about helping people kind of hack their life. It's like to do with life hacks and changing habits. But we work with lots of businesses on this. So we'll go into an organisation and provide them with, all these different resources so that they can try and better their lives.
Another area, of course, which we talk about all the time is artificial intelligence. So I've been talking to an entrepreneur called Alex Stephanie, and he's been in the digital space doing some really rather remarkable things, providing services to help the unemployed, homeless people. He's now got a product called Magic Notes, which social workers use. And it's an AI tool essentially to create records of their meeting notes way more efficiently. It's being used now by, as I understand it, really quite large numbers of council. It appears to have massively improved their productivity. And it is just one, but in my view, quite compelling example of the way that there are massive business opportunities from essentially helping the government to achieve its aim of improving the productivity of the public sector.
We've mentioned quite a few different sectors there, and there's obviously commonalities between them in terms of, they're either businesses where they're digitally enabled, or, as you've mentioned with things like sustainability, it's that government-backed, investor-favoured area of businesses. They're more resilient to the economic cycles, and they manage, through whatever it is, people being more health focused. They tap into these kind of longer term consumer and regulatory trends. So there's a lot of opportunity out there as well, but they're just some of the commonalities between them that are worth just mentioning, I think.
My big lesson about all of this is, yes, be aware of the business cycle, but also think about the longer term trends. The trends that are going to be there irrespective of where we happen to be in interest rates going up, interest rates going down, consumer spending going up, consumer spending going down. Beneath these fluctuations, there are strong growth trends, and it's really important if you are an entrepreneur or you want to create a business, work out what those are.
Really good point, Robert. Now, before we move on, I just want to thank our business banking partners, Monzo Business, for supporting this part of the show. Join me and over 600,000 other businesses already banking with Monzo Business and sign up for an account today. Only sole traders or limited company directors in the UK can apply. T's and C's apply.
Thanks, Steph. Let's get back to our interview with Richard Hughes. We talk very much about the immediate challenge, but as you say, every summer you do produce what is, frankly, an absolutely terrifying report about the outlook for public sector debt and liabilities over the coming decades. Just talk us through what your last report said about the central scenario, absent reform, to where the national debt is heading.
Yeah, so that's right. Every 2 years, we do something called the Fiscal Risk and Sustainability Report, which looks at a long-term projection for the UK public finances, so looking 50 years ahead, out to the mid-2070s. And it's based on, we take as our starting point the end of our current 5-year forecast, where government debt is at around 100% of GDP, just below.
Which, to remind people, is... it's the highest it's been since the Second World War.
Yeah. And it's 3 times higher than when I started working in the Treasury, which is back in 2000. So it is elevated historically. And what happens when you look out over the medium term is that when we project tax revenues going forward, they stay at kind of roughly around 40% of GDP where they are now. They fall a bit because one thing you have to bear in mind is that the government gets about 1% of GDP from fuel duty. As cars switch from petrol to electric vehicles, you lose the tax revenues from cars because we don't tax electricity at anywhere near the rate at which we tax petrol. So you lose a bit of tax revenue, about 1% of GDP over that 50-year period as the vehicle fleet switches away from petrol-driven cars to electric ones. But what really drives a big increase in debt over that period is a rise on the spending side. So government spending goes from about 40% of GDP up to 60% of GDP by the end of that period, and that leaves about a 20% of GDP deficit by the end of that forecast period, and those deficits mount up over time, and the interest costs of the extra debt mounts up over that period of time, so that you're debt burden goes from about 100% of GDP today to about 270% of GDP by the time you get to the end of that 50-year period. And about half of that is from an increase in non-interest spending, in particular upward pressure on health spending, but also on pensions and other age-related spending, because over that period, we've got an aging society, more and more people in retirement claiming pensions and also needing to be looked after, and fewer people working and paying taxes to fund that. And it's health that drives the single biggest rise in non-interest spending. It goes from about 7.5% of GDP today to about 14.5% of GDP by the end of the 50-year period. The state pension adds about another 2.5% of GDP to total spending over that period. And I should say that's also based on the assumption that defense spending stays roughly where it is at the moment as a share of GDP at just over 2%. Were you to add defense to that list of pressures, that would push up the non-interest spending part even further and the level of debt even further.
And so just to be clear, in a nutshell, we're bust in 50 years.
I mean, in 50 years, our current set of tax and spending policies are not sustainable. That's not unique, I should say, to the UK. When you look at these projections for pretty much any other advanced economy, they also see debt rising, and countries which have even more acute demographic problems see even bigger rises in debt because they've got their workforces are shrinking even faster, and more, an even bigger proportion of their population is in old age, claiming a pension and needing healthcare.
Is there a scenario then where, because obviously it costs more for the government to borrow money, the less likely they look to be able to pay it back, and that's why when we had the Liz Truss disaster, it looked like we weren't good for the money, so suddenly our borrowing costs went up. But given everyone's in the same boat, essentially, lots of countries are like this, could it be that it doesn't, the cost to service the debt doesn't go up by as much as you might think, because basically everyone's in the same boat, so therefore it'll just, maybe rates will come, bonds will come down, it'll be cheaper?
So bond yields are the product of supply and demand for government debt. And so if everybody's supplying more debt, and the thing you've got to bear in mind is that if workforces are shrinking and fewer people are saving and more people are spending, the demand for that debt is actually going down. So that's unlikely to put downward pressure on yields. If anything, it will put upward pressure because there are lots of governments on the market trying to borrow, and there are fewer and fewer savers and workers and savers in the world willing to lend the money, and more people who want to draw down their pension rather than contribute to their pension. So the sort of global debt market dynamics don't look particularly favourable to that kind of proposition.
So just to be clear, though, there are only two or three ways, well, actually basically two ways of solving this. Either we've got to somehow get our birth rate up massively, or get very comfortable with people coming from the rest of the world to work here, or have millions of robots effectively doing the jobs that currently people are doing. That's one scenario, because then you've got, essentially, whether it's robots or people working to pay for the costs of an elderly population, whether they're healthcare costs or pensions, or we've just got to decide we can't afford our healthcare and we can't afford our pensions, and they've got to be slashed. Is there another solution?
I guess, broadly speaking, you've got three choices. You can try and raise more revenue, and what you've seen in the UK in the recent past has been governments putting up taxes by a lot. But
there's a limit to that.
At some point, there is a limit to that. Our taxes are headed for an all-time high as a share of GDP, but taxes are higher elsewhere. But raising taxes does have a distortionary impact on human behaviour. It affects people's incentives to work. It affects businesses' incentives to invest, and so it can have knock-on consequences for the productivity of the economy. You can constrain the growth in spending below the scenario I outlined, and you've seen in the recent past governments trying to do that, trying to constrain growth in welfare spending. You can see in this government spending plans trying to get the rate of spending growth below the long-run growth rate of the economy as well. So there are elements already of governments making those choices in this country, and you can see other countries around the world also making similar choices.
But deficits are still, bigger than is sustainable.
They are. They're now still at 4 or 5% of GDP in terms of deficits. You've got to get them down below 2% if you don't want your debt to keep rising and rising. The third choice is can you get the economy to grow faster? And we do have a scenario in that long-term risk report which shows that if you can get productivity back to where it was pre-financial crisis, many of these fiscal problems go away, and essentially debt stays more or less flat over the next 50 years. If you can get productivity up by about 1% a year back to the rates at which it was pre-financial crisis, I think but the catch is governments have to not spend any of that extra money, right? They have to, the economy has to grow faster, but they have to not end up spending more of it on public services or deliver tax cuts to people, and that may well prove to be a challenge.
I mean, I suppose the interesting question is we've got an institution, the OBR, that says, for goodness sake, think about the long term, government, Prime Minister, Chancellor. And yet what we typically do in this country is lurch from mini crisis to mini crisis. And the kind of really fundamental structural reforms never happen. How do we take your work and then translate that into the kind of public debate that might mean that governments start putting us on a footing that is affordable and sustainable?
So I think we do. I think we have a fairly rich and informed economic policy debate here in the UK. We have sort of podcasts like yours, kind of well-read economic magazines and newspapers which focus on economic, financial and fiscal matters. So I think there is quite a rich and well-informed and active debate about the economic and fiscal future of the country.
But there don't seem to be the incentives for governments to make the tough decisions.
I think it's fundamentally, I think all of us have a sort of near-term, short-term bias in our decision-making, and we put off the things which we know are good for us in the long term. What we try and do at the OBR is do the kind of work and analysis that draws attention to these longer term issues. And I think in a number of areas of policy making, I think in the UK, we are sort of ahead of other countries in trying to make choices that face up to demographic realities. Probably the most obvious one is in the area of the state pension age. We have a state pension age which has been rising over time as people have had more years of healthy life, so that they spend roughly about a third of their life in retirement. In other countries, they are well behind us in terms of reflecting higher life expectancy in terms of the age at which people start drawing on a state pension.
And we've seen what a nightmare that's been in France, for example, where the president has wanted to increase the pension age and has been blocked.
Yeah, indeed. We're here. I mean, one of the things that is going to happen over the next 5 years is the state pension age is going to go up by a year. And it is something which doesn't attract very much comment here.
It feels like it's only ever tinkering around the edges and never reform. It always feels like it's just little things here and there that'll annoy the cohort of people who, fall negatively because of it. And really, would it not be better to do something more extreme, which, might anger a lot of people who get caught out in it at the time, but then for longer term prosperity, it's better because tinkering annoys people anyway and doesn't make masses of difference.
So I think it does come back to this point that what the government is trying to do is make small but meaningful differences to some very large numbers. So if you're trying to affect how many people in the workforce, adding an extra year to the retirement age keeps people in work for an extra year and makes a bit of a difference to the number of people who are employed.
But why not add 5 and just bite the bullet? And then you're going to obviously annoy everyone who falls into that 5-year category. But at least you'll get yourself further on because it's inevitable anyway. And you're just going to, annoy people every year as you rise it every year.
I suppose at any point you're trying to minimise the amount of disruption you're doing to an economy. And so I think those are considerations.
Certainly the most contentious reform that the government has recently announced has been making it harder for disabled people to claim the personal independence payment, cutting the health-related element of universal credit, and then saying it's going to invest a significant sum of money in helping disabled people get into work, physically and mentally disabled people into work. Is your instinct that this will make the bill for disability incapacity payments more sustainable?
So this is something which we have had an initial look at in the context of our forecast. I mean, it does reduce the cost of the system in 5 years' time compared to where it was headed in our autumn forecast. But rather than having health-related benefits rising to £80 billion, they instead rise to £75 billion. So it's affecting the trajectory of what is a rapidly rising element of the government's budget. But I should say We got the government's package of reforms quite late in the day in this forecast. We've been able to analyse the direct fiscal impacts of the benefit changes. We did not have time, and we were not given the information we needed to look at what might be the employment effects of those policy changes. There's also elements of the package which at the moment are relatively unspecified, in particular the employment support that the government is also putting in to help people from benefits back into work. That is something which, at the moment, all we know is that there will be a programme and it will cost £1 billion in 5 years' time. We will need a lot more detail on that in order to assess what we think might be its long-term employment effects. And so it's something at the moment we could only give a partial answer to when we looked at it a few weeks ago and incorporated into our forecast, mainly around the benefit changes. We will take a further look between now and our forecast in the autumn about how the rest of the package contributes to this wider question of to what extent can you make a meaningful difference to this group of people who have fallen out of the workforce or not joined the workforce for health reasons, and to what extent will the government's policies make a difference to that?
Is it appropriate to announce something as potentially painful as this for vulnerable people, absent the kind of really important detail that we have?
I think it is oftentimes the case that we are looking at parts of policies rather than a complete strategy. I think that is kind of in the nature of policy making. We have to do 2 forecasts a year, and at that time, we need to take a snapshot of those bits of the policies that we understand. And as another illustration of that, the government had been undertaking a set of planning reforms over the course of last year, but it was only really in December that there was enough detail for us to understand what it might potentially mean for residential investment and long-term house building. So at any point in time, I think we're always trying to interpret and make economic and fiscal sense of what we do know about government policy. But it's sort of natural, as well as because governments need to consult those affected, that policy can change and evolve over time. And we have to make a judgment about when is the appropriate time to try and capture that in our forecasts.
Well, that was absolutely fascinating. I mean, it is, I think, so important to open the window on what the OBR does because, as I said, you have become absolutely a sort of linchpin of the way everything's run here.
And I mean, it's incredible all the things we've got through as well. It's like a world tour of stats. And as someone who loves a good spreadsheet, it's very much in my bag, Richard. So thank you very much for your time.
Yeah, it's been absolutely gripping.
Thank
See you
you
again soon.